Dungeons and Drama Nerds. I'm Nick, here today with Percy.
Hello.
And special guest Dominique Dickey.
Hello.
Dom is a speculative fiction writer and game designer whose work includes TTRPGs like Plant Girl Game and Tomorrow on Revelation 3, both published by Sly Robot Games, and fiction including their new novella, Redundancies and Potentials, published by Neon Hemlock Press. We have asked them here today, however, to talk about adaptation in RPGs. To sort of kick us off, is there anything else about yourself or your work that you would like to mention, either for context or for bragging?
Most of my experience in RPG adaptation has been with IP work through my day job at Monty Cook Games, so I'll probably touch on that a little bit while we're talking. And I also have, separately from that, experience with adapting fiction to stage from, college theater. So we'll also be talking about that. So for context of, things that I am referencing that are outside of the scope of my, bio.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you've somewhat answered this, but for a more specific question, do you have a particular relationship to adaptation? Are there adapted works that have been significant to you as a reader or a player? Are there particular adaptations you've worked on as a writer or artist that you really enjoy doing or were important to you?
Yeah, I worked on the Old Gods of Appalachia RPG adaptation, which was a really big project in terms of the scope of it, and I learned a lot in the process of working on that. And I also attempted to adapt Chronicle of the Death Foretold for stage. That was a tough one. I aimed really high. It was ambitious. And that's something that I still would like to see happen, but of course the resources and ability to get that off the ground are very different as an adult who would have to have money and not the backing of a university arts department.
Yeah. That's a real struggle I have found in my own theater practice. I'm like, boy, doing this as an adult is hard without lots of money.
Yeah, theater was so much a part of my identity, as an artist, but also as a person when I was in undergrad. And as an adult, a lot of my friends and my broader network from college who did go into theater full time, now 5 years later, I think only one person I know is still in theater full time. So it is kind of there are people that are a lot of my friends are still keeping a hand in locally, but I haven't worked on a show in 4 or 5 years, and that's weird for me because I think I also, when I'm working with people at Sly Robot in an editorial and project management capacity, I introduce myself as a stage manager. I tend to approach almost every kind of top-down task from a stage management perspective. And it's very weird to have gotten to a point in my life where theater feels kind of out of reach for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's... I haven't worked on an... Well, that's not quite true, but I haven't worked on a staged production in a few years. So I have started sort of telling people I'm more of an academic, but A, I miss it, and I want to get back to it, and B, I also tend to approach everything in a sort of dramaturgical capacity,
Yes.
even though even when it's yes, my work as editing this magazine article, not performance related, but yeah.
Yeah. It really touches everything that that you do for, I think, the rest of your life when you get theater pilled.
It's so true. Yeah, jokes about saying thank you 10 in a non-theatrical context aside, it's useful. I heard exactly what you said, and I'm acknowledging that you said it.
Mm-hmm.
You know that I heard you and I understood you.
On Discord with a friend, they have to step away for a minute to go feed their cat or whatever. They come back, thank you back.
But no, but it's also it's such a it shapes your way of understanding human relationships and connections so significantly. I don't know. I always don't think that I'm that theater pilled, and then I hang out with people who never did theater or who did theater when they were very young and then never did it in college or professionally, and I'm oh, I you are not affectionate physically.
Oh,
You
God.
don't you are
You've
closed off in
never
certain ways.
you've never had that experience of being super obnoxious in the Denny's at 2 a.m. Like
You've never had to become close enough to someone that you can like do creative stuff with them in the space of like a day.
you've never had to like facilitate someone's quick change in a way that just felt like you were stripping them very efficiently.
And maybe you were stripping them very efficient. Sometimes
That
it's a
forges
really
a
elaborate
kind
change.
of bond that
That can't be broken.
a huge thing I had to do in high school that was really embarrassing because I was younger than the actor I was working with, but I had to like get someone into pants in like under 15 seconds. And because like while this was happening, she was like changing the top half of her costume, right? But getting pants on someone who is like also a full-size human being, incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
That
Yes.
does sound really hard.
Difficult and intimate.
Yes.
In ways that's just a fact.
I've also been like, I feel like because I mostly was in tech and did some acting, but when I was like younger, I feel like when I'm out in the world, I don't have like discernible like theater kid energy. I just seem like really type A in really specific ways. But then when I'm with theater people, they're like, you are a theater person. And that's always, I love that like recognition. That's kind of like a little bit under the radar. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Hell yeah.
Well, we did want to focus today on talking about adaptation. So before we dive into like how that works, what that is, it feels like it would be useful to start with some kind of like unpacking of what adaptation is actually. So I was curious, do either of you have a working definition of adaptation that they like? Or like what something needs to have to qualify as an adaptation, as opposed to, I don't know, just a riff.
I think.
Go ahead. I have like a hot take. So if you have, I have a hot take, which is that like, I think the most common like definition I've heard is like, taking a story that was originally told in one medium and telling it in a different medium. But I also think like there is like a giant gray area of like where the word story gets like fuzzy.
Oh yeah.
Where it's like, could you consider a play about like the Stonewall riots and like the Star stuff that is not necessarily telling a specific story from that time, but is like inspired by that era and those events? Is that an adaptation of that history? You know what I mean? Like, I think that is like a gray area that I think is like contested.
Yeah, I also think about like work that is inspired by, references other work, or contains other work. Like, is John Proctor as the villain an adaptation of The Crucible because it has like parts of The Crucible embedded in it?
It also like has a recognizable
right.
John Proctor and Abigail like characters.
Like right, but I think I think that's where I get into like, I'm gonna have to talk about High School Musical.
you do actually, yeah. Now legally, you are required to talk about High School Musical.
Okay. So, you know how in High School Musical 1, it is a musical about the performance of a fictional musical. Right?
Are we gonna get to High School Musical, the show?
Yes, as a layer of a layer of abstraction.
I'm sorry. Carry on.
In the first one, they're performing a musical, and we as the audience see much of the musical, but a lot of it is elided, and it's also a musical that doesn't exist. If that were a performance of a real musical within this movie, would the movie be an adaptation?
If the musical they were doing was like Showboat or something,
right?
You're saying,
then would it be an adaptation?
What a crazy musical!
I don't know why Showboat was like the one that I just threw out there. I'm not a musical theater person.
For them to do in High School Musical.
Not a musical theater person, really. I don't know why Showboat was my point of reference, but there you go.
I mean, Sure, we can go with it. Yeah. At
But the
what point
plot.
would it become an adaptation? At what point would the like container plot that the musical is nested in have to mirror the like internal plot in
Right,
order
right.
for it to be an adaptation and not just referential? I think about this a lot. Also,
My take, my semi hot take was going to be to pull in the opposite direction of Percy, which is I kind of like the, because I'm old fashioned, I kind of like the like formal definition of adaptation, of being like it has to take a structure from one thing and turn it into a structure in another. So I think if High School Musical, if the events of High School Musical, in a sort of winking self-referential way, mirrored the events of whatever the musical they're performing is, then I would say that's like very much an adaptation, as opposed to just being like a story about people doing another
right.
performance.
And then when you pull back a layer, High School Musical, the musical, the series is that.
Yeah.
Great. I don't know that. I'm not that deep in High School Musical, but I believe you.
High School Musical, the musical, the series is wild.
So, okay, an unfortunate thing that has set me, an unfortunate thing that set me on like a lifelong trajectory of being obsessed with art that contains art within it, or art that is about art making and references the art that is being made in the art making, is High School Musical, the first one, and the Phantom of the Opera movie adaptation. Both came out within a year of each other at a very formative age for me. Um, and I realized recently, like some very recently, that those two things are kind of like wired into the same part of my brain. Um, so I think that when I think about art that is like in a container of other art, it's always going to go back to those two things for me.
Mm.
I am also an art within the container of other art enjoyer. Um, I'm thinking about a book that I read for a class on adaptation that I took in grad school. We had to read Linda Hutchins' A Theory of Adaptation. Um, and she has like all of this like highbrow stuff about how an adaptation is a palimpsest, where you are always viewing the adaptation with the original work in mind, et cetera, et cetera. But she also has chapters on like theme parks that I am like, is Universal Studios Wizarding World of Harry Potter an adaptation of Harry Potter?
I think yes.
I Yes, in the sense that an RPG is ever an adaptation, because I think a lot about how when you take a narrative fiction and adapt it into a like interactive medium,
Yeah.
it's less about the story than it is about the world. And if it's I think like for the Old Gods adaptation, there are narrative touch points, but it wasn't really finding a way to retell the podcast story. It was a way to like put players in the podcast sandbox. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that like Wizarding World does is an adaptation in that sense because you get to be a wizard.
Yeah.
Yeah. I something that Julie Rachel Morris, who's my adaptation teacher, once said that I think has held true and is nice because it applies like very broadly, is that for me an adaptation is something that is attempting in some way to recover or recreate the feeling of encountering the original, not necessarily even the plot, which is why it's like you can look at this, you can look at very broad adaptations where she encouraged us to be like, what would it mean to adapt like this orchestra concerto into a stage play?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but to that point, then I think, yeah, like Wizarding World is an adaptation of Harry Potter because within the form of like a theme park,
Mm-hmm.
it is
Right.
trying to promote the same like or similar kind of emotional experiences in the way that like theme parks can do that, which is
Yeah.
different from the way a movie does that.
Well, and I think your point that like in order for an RPG to count as an adaptation at all, it actually cannot be about the story, because
Right.
like an RPG that has a predetermined story that you're telling is often not that satisfying with.
Yeah, and I think that there can be things like the D&D books that are like a directed campaign and a book, but there's still room for player choice, just like chained adventures. So I think it's really like the creating a world that feels open, but that it feels recognizable, and also a world that I think that's something that is like difficult for me as a player in playing games that are adaptations, and I've seen be difficult like in playtesting of things that I've worked on. Is that if it is a player that is familiar with the source material, but they're playing a character who has like agency in the world that they're in, um, how do you encourage people to make choices that would like break the world as they experience it in canon?
Hmm.
Because I think that like people are reluctant to do that.
I had this experience even playing Lady Blackbird, which I think is not like really a Firefly adaptation, but it feels so much like a Firefly adaptation that like I was thinking about it the whole time I was playing. Like
That makes sense. That I see that. I had not thought about that, but I do see that.
I don't think I haven't put any thought into this, and I also haven't seen Firefly in so many years that I don't think I could, even if I did put a lot of thought into it. Like I don't think that the pre-gen characters map onto. Well, no, Cyrus Vance absolutely does actually map onto the captain who's played by a man whose name I forget.
Nathan Fillion.
Nathan Fillion?
Yeah. Like I actually do think if you look, they probably would map somewhat onto the crew. But yeah, like but then that gets into like a gray area of like inspiration and like drawing on other media and like because there are people also who start a D&D campaign and are like, I want to play Brendan Fraser from The Mummy, and that's my character.
My first D&D character was Michelle Obama as a human wizard.
That's amazing.
So yeah,
no,
word up.
So what you're saying is you've done an adaptation of Michelle Obama into a D&D 5th edition character sheet.
Yeah, pretty much.
Michelle Obama, the human woman.
Yes.
Okay, so it's less about the plot and more about the vibes.
Yeah, I feel like removing plot from the equation would have
disastrous consequences.
No, I was gonna say it would have set expectations in a way that allowed a lot of people to avoid disappointment.
Yeah.
In a time period that was also formative for me, just in terms of where it hit in my life, which was the YA book to movie boom of the mid 2010s.
Yep. Same.
But I think a lot about how like limitations of form and how limitations of form, like that is what makes the work what it is, right? Like an example that I have been kind of like ruminating on for a bit is that now that a human person has seen Starry Night, you could probably definitely do like pixel art Starry Night adaptation, right? However, if Van Gogh, the original Van Gogh, was working at MS Paint, we would not have Starry Night.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that like when you go into watching a movie adaptation and are looking for it to capture the vibe and not be one-to-one, and realize that sometimes plot can be a casualty of the like translation across mediums, I feel like a lot of little teenagers would have been less mad about certain events. I say as one such teenager, formerly.
I mean, I don't know if this is what you're referencing, but the thing that this is making me think of is the Hunger Games adaptation, specifically because it's in the zeitgeist right now. But it is like a new book released.
New book.
Oh, I'm out of
out of the YA novel.
I saw that the new book released, and I was like,
it's people are
that,
like revisiting the movies, and I mean the book The Hunger Games and the Hunger Games trilogy of books and the Hunger Games quadrilogy of movies are telling very different stories and saying very different things, because in one you are witnessing the internal life of one person.
Yeah.
And you can't do that in a movie.
Yes.
Unless you're like doing something incredibly specific. And even then, I don't know that that's always a very successful or easy thing to do in a movie.
There's this article that I don't remember who wrote it, but I have the tab open, but I have like 70 tabs open, so that doesn't really mean anything. But it like went like internally viral like in my social circle within the past like few months, and it was about I think the title is like Turning Off the Movie in Your Mind. And it's about how a lot of writers who have like started writing within the past like 10, 15 years don't have a natural impulse towards building in that like close interiority and write like they are writing a movie, but just in prose. And it's like you're working in a medium that can do different things, like dream bigger, do the thing that the medium can do that you wouldn't be able to do in a film.
Yeah.
Don't write a book like you're writing a screenplay.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's the opposite problem of that in the Hunger Games trilogy, where it's like you're working in a medium that has different limitations but also has different strengths. I think in the first movie, the use of shaky cam is a great choice that I do have some complaints about. I think it would have been more impactful if it had began when she entered the arena than if it had been from the very beginning.
Yeah.
In the same way that in Catching Fire, the aspect ratio changes when she enters the arena, which Catching Fire is a perfect movie.
It's a great movie.
Is it a perfect adaptation? No. It's a perfect movie.
Well, and people are so upset about specific changes that they make from the books to the movies, but a lot of them are defensible as much easier to convey if you don't have access to the internal monologue of Katniss.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I also read this article, and I Googled it quickly. It's by Lincoln Michelle. I think I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Yes, on Lincoln Michelle's Substack, Countercraft. Great essay.
Yeah, I didn't want to misattribute it, because I was like, I know I have this tab somewhere, but my laptop is a mess.
Yeah. But yeah, I think maybe just because there's such a common like adaptation pathway, the like book to movie adaptation form is really like a useful one to think about. I did read all the Hunger Games books, and I did see all the movies, but I am not as like deeply tapped into them to have opinions on them. But
I think you and I, Dom, are close enough to the same age that like we read Divergent and the Hunger Games at a formative time.
Yes, I was like
we're within 2 years of each other, I think, because you're the same age as CJ.
I'm 30. No, I'm older than CJ.
No, okay. I'm 26, so close enough.
Yeah, we're in the same zone.
Close enough. You read the same books.
I am, for the record, only 3 years older than Percy. but I was like a little bit out of the like YA scene when Hunger Games hit. But I was going to say an adaptation that I think works fairly well that I had never thought about until I was like taking a course on adaptations, and it sounds like is almost the like opposite angle from the Hunger Games, where the books are very focused on interiority. The Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, I think, does a really good job that I had never thought about until I started really thinking about adaptation, of making the story more intimate and human than Tolkien's writing, which is very like removed, not profoundly removed, but like very like kind of in this historical register. And then I happened to watch one of the movies while taking this class, and I was like, oh my god, all of these like close-ups and like shots of unvoiced moments and glances between characters and stuff. That's shit that like J.R.R. Tolkien does not do in his writing.
Even I'm watching the Lord of the Rings movies with my friend Chris for the first time, really, because the only other time I've watched these movies, it was on a marathon first date with a girl when I was in college who insisted on watching all of the extended editions back to back to back, and I thought it was like a Netflix and chill situation. It was not. She wanted to watch all 3 Lord of the Rings movies in a row.
This is my favorite Percy story.
this is some of my best lore.
Holy shit.
Chris, friend of the pod, Chris Diercksen, was like, this is unacceptable. You have to watch these movies. And we just recently watched The Two Towers. And I'm thinking about even just like the storytelling visually of the Battle of Helm's Deep is so good.
Yeah.
And I can see that being, having not read the books, because God, why would I? That's such a project. Like I can see a book with a sort of historical register not paying attention to the like feeling and energy, because I think the reason that scene works so well is because of how viscerally you feel the pivot when the Rohirrim show up and they're like, oh, okay, no, like we're saved.
Yeah, and on the sort of like personal level too. Yeah, it's just interesting to me. We've got in these two different examples, both of which I think everyone is agreeing, are like pretty good adaptations.
I'm like not super familiar with Lord of the Rings, but
Fair enough.
I feel like a fake nerd when I admit that. So continue.
Your secret is safe with us.
That's we're only going to air it to all of our listeners, but that's still pretty safe.
I've pop culture osmosed enough that I know the like basic plot, and I've seen most of the movie in GIFs at this point.
There you go. That's all you need.
Well, and what I was going to say was it's interesting to me because there's a sort of opposite pole of like, what is the form good at? So, Lord of the Rings, big old kind of tomes where he's trying to write this quasi-historical thing. And then the movie has pulled it toward, like, what movies are, I would say, better at than that, which is, like, psychology, basically, intimacy with characters. And then, The Hunger Games is written in this way that is, like, deeply internal in a way that books can be if you write them that way, and movies really struggle to do without like extensive voiceover, but that doesn't work very well usually. And then those movies have pulled it more toward, like cinematic action and the shaky cam that Dom was talking about, the like idea of perspective and some sort of kind of objectivity.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I just think that's cool.
I guess this has me also thinking about House of the Dragon as an adaptation of Fire and Blood, which, like, Fire and Blood is written as if it were, like, an in-universe textbook, right? Mm-hmm. But then House of the Dragon is an adaptation of that that I see not in the way as someone would adapt, like, fiction, but more so in the way that someone would adapt, like, the War of the Roses, like if it were actually right, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That like
yeah.
Like the adaptation of House of the Dragon is to Fire and Blood the way HBO Rome from like 2005, 2000, I don't know, is to the giant fucking Roman history book that Fire and Blood is based on, but I don't remember who.
The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire
that
by
mm-hmm.
whichever like British man that was.
Yes. Where it feels like rather than treating Fire and Blood as source material for the narrative completely, it allows that book to remain like an in-universe artifact and then extrapolates a story from that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is a very, like, it's a distinction that is hard to articulate, but I think that you, like, kind of get what I'm pointing out with that.
I do, and I think, I think there's two, like, important things about that make it work really well, one of which is that Fire and Blood, like you said, is written as this in-universe artifact, which I feel like lets the showrunners kind of be like, okay, but, like, any of this might be false.
Right.
In a sort of like historiographical sense of like, this is the artifact that has been received and we will like fill in whatever we want with it. And the other important thing that I think is always useful to remember in adaptation is that like Fire and Blood, the book, is bad.
Yes.
Yes. So like you shouldn't adapt it too faithfully because it's bad. I watched House of the Dragon and enjoyed it like pretty well, and it was like, oh, maybe I'll read this. I got like a little way into it. I was like, I'm not reading this.
Okay, so we had the same experience pretty much. That I watched the season 2 felt like a casualty of the writer's strike to me, in that it could have been better, and I can see where it would have been better. But it's still like it was fun TV. And the book is not a fun book, but I think what I like about the potential of the book is that because it's like written as an in-world artifact, it is written from the perspective of a character and with that character's biases, and it is wrong in places compared to like how canon appears in other material that is also like within the larger. I'm not even that big into A Song of Ice and Fire, but I'm going to sound like I am, so whatever. I just know a lot for whatever reason.
You're not alone. I loved those books when I was in high school, and that's embarrassing to me now, but I really love them.
You know what's... That series, the first book is older than me.
It's a good book.
And there hasn't been a new one since I was a teenager.
Yeah,
And
I finished Feast for Crows right as Dance with Dragons came out, and I felt like I won the fucking lottery.
that must have been a time.
It was
Because what year was that?
Maybe 24. I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like I was in 10th grade when this happened.
A Dance with Dragons, 2011.
Oh my
I
god,
was
I was
gonna
younger
say
than that.
I didn't come to any of these books until after I wasn't aware of them until the show started.
I was a member of a website called teenagewriters.com where a lot of the people who were you on teenagewriters.com?
Yes!
Did we know this?
I don't think we've talked about this actually. This is like lore. I don't think we've talked about this.
We're gonna talk about this later. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, a lot of people on teenagewriters.com really liked the Song of Ice and Fire books.
I feel like somehow we got sidetracked from something we were talking
something
about.
that I was going to say. We're talking about medium specificity.
Oh yes.
Not to I actually think this will just be an episode where we talk about media that we like and dislike, and I think that actually is okay. I recently on a whim was like browsing HBO and was like, oh, I'll watch the Kevin, however you say his last name, Watchmen movie, or no, Zack Snyder Watchmen movie. Having never read the graphic novel, and I was like, this is a dog shit movie with horrible music choices. I had to turn it off when Night Owl and Silk Spectre were fucking to Jeff Buckley's Hallelujah in the Owl spaceship. But then I read the graphic novel and I was like, oh, he did a panel for panel, faithful, almost exact adaptation of this graphic novel, which is not sort of playing into what movies are good at all, especially in a genre like superhero movies, which admittedly, like, Watchmen is an anti-superhero story, but like whatever, like it is still presented in the same way a superhero comic is written. So it's like, oh, what are you doing?
Like, have you seen the series?
I haven't yet, but I've heard that it is better.
The series hits it out of the park in ways that I cannot even describe to you.
But also, like, does not care that much about fidelity to the graphic novel. Is that true?
Just watch it.
Okay.
I will say, in terms of fidelity, I agree with Dom. It hits it out of the park. It is also doing an entirely separate plot.
Yeah.
So like it is not concerned with fidelity. it's riffing on the same. That would be, I would say, more of a riff than an adaptation.
I would say it's a sequel that just happens to be in a different medium.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It is continuous, and it picks up perfectly on everything I love about the graphic novel, but it does it in ways that actually work on TV. Yes. And it makes such good use of the miniseries as a form. But it also maintains, like, it is continuous in canon, and it maintains all the same, like, themey, vibey stuff that got me about the graphic novel.
Yeah. I guess for me that opens up a question of not just of fidelity, because I think I have the feeling, tell me if you disagree, that, like, there is you can't really know until you've hit it line of, like, when something stops being an adaptation in terms of, like, you've stopped, like, either utilizing the world or retelling the story.
Yes.
But I also think, like, I'm curious, I have, like, a reflexivity question, which is, like, if you're doing an adaptation of something, inevitably you have, like, a reason that you want to adapt it. And I'm interested in, like, how that sort of impacts the work of adaptation in terms of, like, how that affects what you focus on. Because I know there are many people who do, like I wrote an adaptation of the Percival myth, which is, or not myth, the, like, poem from the 12th century. That is, like, an explicitly, like, trans retelling of it, because that's, like, where I got my first name from. And that's, like, very explicitly, like, an adaptation with, like, me doing something that's not what Wolfram von Eschenbach is trying to do. But I'm curious about the line in terms of, like, how our sort of, like, perspectives affect an adaptation.
I'll just offer a thing that a thing where I was like, oh, that's so clever, and I've never thought about that until I was asked to think about it, is that for me, I was taught adaptation and translation as like two parts of a sequence, where part of the point of the sequence being like, these are kind of sneakily the same thing. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think anytime you do an adaptation, there's a reason you want to adapt thing A into thing B, and I think a genuine like I just want to turn this thing unchanged into the same thing in another medium is usually results in a bad adaptation.
Yeah.
Because you can't like that's what you find out when you have to translate something is like you can't escape your own perspective on it. Like inevitably, if you're translating something from one language to another, like the writing that comes out is yours, even if part of your goal is to be as faithful as possible to
Well,
the original text.
Zack Snyder clearly thinks that Rorschach is the hero of Watchmen.
But does he know that he thinks that? I have
No,
not watched the Watchmen movie,
I
so
don't
I don't
think
know.
he does.
Yeah.
I think something that like really shows with a lot of adaptation, and I think a lot of the ones that really sucked in the 2010s is when the reason is just money.
Right. Yeah.
When you know that you have a market, when you know that you have people who enjoyed it in one form, you can probably get to engage with it in a different form just out of curiosity or excitement, and you also know that putting it in a new form will allow you to reach a market who wouldn't have engaged with the other form. And that's like, okay, like, should we throw a party? Should we invite J.K. Rowling?
I mean, the thing that makes me think of, which I'm shady about at some point in this outline, is as a person who has worked on one of them, Broadway musical adaptations of movies. Which very often are the only way we feel we can get people to go see theater is if it is an IP they already know. See either like loose adaptations like the Betty Boop musical that's airing right now, or like I did an adaptation of the 1993 Kevin Kline film Dave at Arena when I worked there.
Interesting.
I mean, it was like fun. It was a good musical. That is, I think, like a slightly less egregious example of this like sort of capitalism phenomenon, because it's not like it is like a recognizable IP. I don't know that I would say it's like a rip-roaringly popular
yeah,
IP.
But that wouldn't have occurred to me as a thing to even adapt. Like,
yeah.
How did you get there?
Well, they had like a very clear point of view because we were doing it in 2018. I think we were doing it in the summer of 2018. So like they started writing it around the 2016 election. And the story of Dave is, if you're unfamiliar with the premise of this old movie that the premise is that there's this guy whose name is Dave, and he looks exactly like the president Bill Mitchell. And Bill Mitchell is medically indisposed and unable to be the president for a reason that I don't remember. So his chief of staff and another woman who I don't remember what her role is, get this guy Dave, who's just like a guy, he's a history teacher, to pretend to be the president. And he falls in love with the first lady, and it's like a whole thing. But the whole point of the movie is like anybody can, like, civic participation is important, like anybody can make a difference. And I don't remember how it lands that, given the incredibly unrealistic scenario of anyone who looks exactly like the president can be asked to be the president. But they had a really clear point of view. They had something they were trying to say about civic participation and the sort of lack of access that ordinary people have to the rooms where these decisions are made, and like the government and all of this stuff. So that felt more successful to me than, say, like Legally Blonde or Mean Girls or Beetlejuice or any number of other things.
The Mean Girls, the trajectory of that, it makes me so mad.
Like, yeah, the movie adaptation of the Mean Girls musical.
Okay. It was a book. No one gives a shit. It was a movie. Great movie. It was a musical. Why? It was a musical movie. Why?
I forgot that it was a book. That's crazy.
Yeah, well, because the movie is from what I've heard, I haven't read the book, but the movie is so wildly different. I think it kind of does the same like nonfiction adaptation into fiction type thing, where my understanding, and I could be wrong about this, is that the book was written for parents of teenage girls and is
Yeah.
about bullying.
Yeah, I
Oh.
was gonna say it's based on a non-fiction book, I
So it's more
think.
of an inspired by than an adaptation. I think that is a good example of that, right?
Mm.
Hmm.
Um, so I feel like, but I think that in terms of translating that same concept from if you count the book as a point of origin, the 2004 movie was the last defensible one, and then you gotta leave
Oh
it
yeah,
because
we've lost the plot.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think I also like someone said some. I saw someone post online like somewhat recently about Wicked the movie, but like tagged spoilers, and I was like, you're tagging spoilers for a movie that's based on a 20-year-old musical that's based on a 100-something-year-old book, like
Well,
Well,
that's intermittently.
like a different book.
that's based on another movie on that's based on different. Right? Yes. Like, would you spoiler tag the Bible? Like, we all know it.
I think I will start doing that now. Actually, I think that would be a really funny bit.
Spoilers. It's Easter.
I
I feel like you work your way into weird youth pastor energy at some point there, where you're like, you guys won't believe what happened on Sunday, and I won't be telling you.
spoilers. He comes back. Um, I mean, also a question, and I'm asking this question with the recognition I actually haven't read the book Wicked. Is Wicked an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, or is it a response to The Wizard of Oz? And how similar are those endeavors?
It's a. I also haven't read it,
Oh,
but my understanding is that it's a prequel.
It's like, yeah, it's a prequel. Legally, are
yeah,
you allowed to write a prequel for a book that you haven't? I guess you can. I
you
guess who would
can,
stop
yeah,
you?
but to your point though, Percy. So I have read the book. I really like Wicked. I don't like the subsequent books in the series as much, but I think Wicked is very solid.
Is it true that it's really horny?
It's moderately horny. Mostly, it's just like if your point of reference is the musical, it's deeply political and very grim.
Mm.
I've been meaning to read it because apparently it says things about economics.
I mean, yeah, yes, I think I was gonna say it's more about like one of the things I appreciate. This is I'll work myself around to the point originally. I was gonna say one of the things I appreciated about the movie adaptation of the musical is that the musical is largely unfaithful to the book
Mm.
because Broadway audiences don't generally want a like super depressing musical about the rise of authoritarianism. Uh,
You don't say.
like so the book is much darker and grimmer and hornier, yes, but more to the point, like the movie has actually pulled in a very small way some elements with the talking animals and so on that are pointing back to the Gregory Maguire book of like, oh yeah, no, this is a story. This is a not that veiled story about like if not fascism, at least authoritarianism
Can I make a
and
brief
persecution.
interjection to say I
Yeah.
wonder how much of that, going back to medium specificity, is also the fact that in a Broadway musical, Dr. Dillamond is a man, not a goat. Like, you know that that's a guy, and he can't be a goat. But in the movie, is he not a CGI talking goat?
He is a CGI talking goat voiced by Peter Dinklage. Weird take. Um, I think it's actually because a movie has establishing shots, and
Mm.
that gave the movie writer and team space to they have basically filled in for the most part around the edges of the musical, which is almost a bare stage musical. Like it's a very rapidly moving, like set pieces come in and out, and they use the fact that they have like a set or at least the CGI appearance of one to do a lot of kind of like environmental storytelling where it's like, oh, we didn't add any lines to this musical, or not many. I'm sure they added some. But we have like there's a bit at the beginning where I don't know, she fucks up with magic somehow and breaks a like a bit of art of the wizard, like glorifying the wizard, and it falls down, and underneath is this mural that has been clearly like plastered over of, you know, people and talking animals all working together. And like that's a bit of environmental storytelling that you can do in a movie because you can create that whole thing.
Because you can't do world building in a musical because you're following a particular story of particular characters, or at least you can't do world building in the same way.
And it would just take so much investment of time and resources to do that on stage for that brief moment that it's not like financially worth it. Oh, but I was going to say, original question about like, is Wicked, I would say Wicked the book is not an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, not only because it's a different story, but also because it's largely a critique of the original. So I think for me, that sense of like, it's trying to do this, again, I keep going back to the vibes, as Percy put it, of like an adaptation is on some level trying to deliver you a similar thing. And a critique is definitionally not, and I would say in some ways like an homage is also not an adaptation. There's like a lot of artistic responses you can have to things that are playing in the same sandbox, but not really trying to like adapt them, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, I'm like grappling with the question of like, can you adapt something as a, like, can you do a critique of something in your adaptation of it? And I don't actually know how I actually don't know what my answer is. Because I want to say yes, but I can't think of like, yeah.
I feel like you can, but it's always limited if you're trying to really do like, like you end up limiting one angle of it or the other.
I mean, thinking about we just recorded an episode of our Patreon show recently where we were talking about The Tempest. And there's a very famous adaptation of The Tempest called A Tempest, which is a sort of decolonial critique of the project of The Tempest. And I do think that that is, without a doubt, an adaptation of The Tempest.
Yeah, but it also has a different title. And like that's
one
sounds...
word.
Well, I know, but like I think Césaire's like deliberate about that, right? Like, and like yes, I agree, it's an adaptation of The Tempest, but I don't think it's an adaptation that is. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it's hard to do a faithful adaptation, whatever that means, a faithful adaptation of something. And you can like be critical in elements of it, like they do this all the time with casting. You know, where it's like if you change the gender or race or whatever of a character, you may like highlight an element of a story that was not highlighted in the original. But if you're trying to be faithful, it's hard to be really deeply critical. So what were you gonna say, Dom?
Earlier this week, I was at a house party with some theater people, and I started to we were talking about how like when the Into the Woods movie came out in like 2015, it was at the tail end of a wave of like every high school doing Into the Woods, and how that gave a lot of us in the room some of the same brainworms, because I have a theory that I was trying to like build up to, not very coherently, that whatever musical you do your senior year is going to like define something about the rest, and was trying to like gather evidence for this. But then I realized that my senior year musical was a jukebox adaptation of The Tempest, so I should maybe sit down and stop talking.
You gotta be a wizard on an island.
Yeah, with singing Bright Eyes, apparently.
What?
Yeah.
Was this an original thing that your
Yes.
school did? Okay, I was like, does this just exist and I didn't know that there was a Bright
No.
Eyes jukebox musical? Because that's a failure on my part. My senior year musical, which I did tech for, was Bye Bye Birdie, so I don't know what that says about me.
Yeah.
Mine was a production of the extremely bad 1953 Sandy Wilson musical The Boyfriend, which you've never heard of for a reason. And I think what it says about me was when I told my acting teacher, who was not at part of my school, I was like, oh, yeah, my school's doing The Boyfriend, which is something I've never heard of. She had heard of it, and she muttered, huh. She, the choir teacher at my school, must not think she has much talent to pull from this year. It's a very bad musical that requires very little, like, serious singing.
Interesting.
So yes, I'm opposed to this theory personally. But...
Yeah. I think the reason why it was so like I came in so hot with this idea, and then in the process of explaining my idea was like, oh, okay, actually.
Devastating. Okay, I feel we've landed nowhere near like a coherent working definition of an adaptation, but I also think that's fine.
I'm really digging the vibe spaces.
It always comes back to being vibes based, I feel.
And I also think that I don't know, as if I could like go back in time and set up my younger self for less disappointment and frustration, I think a vibes-based definition is more forgiving and also allows you to engage with art on the basis of what it's actually doing and not what you think it should be doing or what you wish it was doing.
Yeah.
Which is something that I try to do more as an adult, and I think is also something that like came from theater and is a very like dramaturgical approach to things. Is I try to meet art like on the terms of, is it good at what it's trying to do and it is trying to do something that is just not for me, or is it trying to do something and it's not hitting that mark, right? I think the like most hater ass way you can hate art is when it is trying to do something that you don't even care about and still failing.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of like movie adaptations that I was so disappointed by when I was younger were maybe just trying to do something that wasn't like a scene by scene translation and like succeeding or at least getting close to success. So I feel like the vibes definition is like not inner child healing, but like inner teenager healing.
Because I feel like too, because I do trans studies, I like any mode of analysis that is centering like what is my like response to something. Like, does this elicit the same response? Does this elicit like a different response in a good way? And particularly, I think if we're talking about adapting like narrative media into a tabletop RPG, like the vibe has to be the same because it has to be like a thing that you love so much you want to be in that world and have agency within it. And if the vibe's not right, like it I think would fall completely flat. I'm also thinking a lot about like what would this is like a tangential question, which is like I'm curious about how many people play TTRPG adaptations of media that they have not consumed and what that's like.
I'm curious about people who use systems that aren't licensed adaptations, but like more open-ended systems, and kind of slot real-world narrative, like craft their own adaptations with their own gaming group. I'm curious about people who do that as a practice, but I'm also curious about how that relates to something that I do a lot, which is like kind of establishing shot thing as a GM, where I will find like a pop culture touch point that my table all shares, and then we'll say like, okay, like imagine the set from this scene and this thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's not an adaptation, and because it is not like interested in the same vibe or the same story, but it does kind of maintain that element that I like, where it's less about the thing than it is about like the sandbox the thing is in.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that makes me think of Starstruck Odyssey, which is the Dimension 20 show where they used like an adapted version of the Scum and Villainy rule set, which itself is a Star Wars reskin of D&D 5th edition to...
Scum and Villainy is Blades in the Dark, isn't it?
Is it?
I don't know. I should look that up.
Pretty sure it's Blades in the Dark. I've never played it.
Oh, but... you're right. It is Fortune.
Oh, yeah,
I'm thinking about...
Yeah.
What's the Star Wars...
there's a shit ton of Star Wars like D&D ripoffs.
Yeah, I think the one they used some Star Wars adaptation of D&D 5th edition. It was absolutely like a D&D reskin.
Right.
I don't know why I thought it was Scum and Villainy. That's a very whatever. But it's telling a story in the world of the comic series of Starstruck Odyssey, which I think is interesting and is also very like creating a sandbox. And I would say actually like the least interesting part of that show was any sort of time mechanics were involved, because the lore of it is so good, and playing like in that world and experiencing the like lore of that world was so much more interesting to me than like how many hit points the ship has.
Yeah.
So wait, I want to be clear, because Brennan Lee Mulligan is my wife's personal enemy. So I haven't watched this. This is mostly a joke.
He's not coming after us.
He might listen. We don't know. Starstruck Odyssey. If I'm piecing this, I haven't watched this, but if I'm piecing this together correctly, Starstruck Odyssey itself is an existing like world property.
It's a comic book
it's
series.
A comic that's by his mom.
His mom.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Okay, cool. Well, that's sweet. But so it's taking that, playing a game within that, using a game that is itself trying to do a like narrative riff on something else.
Yes.
Amazing.
But the game that they use, I looked it up, is called Star Wars 5e, and it's just an overhaul of 5e for Star Wars.
Yeah, but then I think they changed and customized some things.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me, because I know they tend to move things around.
Yeah, and I do also know that when they were shooting it, Elaine, who's Brennan's mom, was with the director and like in Brennan's ear to like give him context or answer questions or like feed him stuff that rounded out like the world, or like was like fact checking ish in real time.
Yeah, I haven't seen the campaign, but I have seen the like talkbacky videos with his mom.
They're really sweet.
They're really cute. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I bring it up only because I'm thinking like what you said made me think about like what it is to be, because that show's different too, because you're like presenting something in the world and it has to like there is an obligation to sort of be right, as opposed to like at a home game table like John, our friend John regularly puts Pokemon in their D&D games that we have to fight and stuff like that. Like I think every DM's like home game is like a horrible Frankenstein of all of the media that you like.
Yeah. Something
great.
Something that has been like done as backer reward type things for my day job has been like for the Magnus Archives RPG running, we'll like run a session with the creators of the IP and either stream it or put it out as a video. And that I have not been a part of one of these things, but it's something that seems terrifying to me because I'm like, what if you goof canon, but this is being broadcast by the creator of the, and I'm like there's so much room for things to get narratively fun but interpersonally awkward in a way that I would not recover from. So
that sounds horrible. I mean, yeah. I remember seeing Jason Cordova in the Gauntlet Discord talk about the process of making the Silt Versus RPG, and he's really clear. Like, I was there to help figure out mechanically how this works. The creators of the podcast were the people who were like codifying the lore and like putting the world into an RPG form, and that like kind of collaboration seems really like fraught and scary to me, but also like potentially very interesting. But I am also like, how wide is the audience for RPGs like that?
Yeah.
Aside from like, I know that many people listen to the Silt Verses and the Magnus Archives and Old Gods of Appalachia and watch Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is the other big adaptation that I can think of.
Yeah.
Although I feel like there was a big like pop of like surge of popularity of the Avatar: The Last Airbender RPG when it first came out, and then nobody talked about it ever again.
Yeah, I don't think I've really heard much about it in the past like 3 or 4 years.
It's not great. I say that as someone who's not particular. I don't know if that came through the microphone. It's not great.
Oh.
It's perfectly fine, I think. I know some people who really love it, but I'm also not a huge Avatar fan. I watched it, so I feel qualified enough to be like, I think they kind of missed the mark. But it's not terrible.
I've been like, I really want to watch Avatar, and I've been told that it gets like more steady on its footing as you get further in. But I have tried like 3 times and keep bouncing off the first like 4 episodes.
This is also my experience. I have not.
Yeah, I can't get into it, and I really want to, but I have not been able to.
I mean, it's made for like 12-year-olds.
I
Well,
watched
that too.
Yeah.
Which is, I say that not as critique, just like for me, the thing that I did this with was, what's it called? She-Ra.
Oh.
Which, like, when it came out, I knew so many people who were like, is amazing, like, fantasy, feminist, queer, and I love all of those things. And I watched, and for me, that was the one where it's like, the first 4 episodes, I'm like, this is just too, like, and I think I would feel that way about Avatar if I were encountering it for the first time ever now as an adult too, where I would just be like, this was made for like a tween.
Yeah.
Which I am not, and that's okay. It's just not for me.
I will say I really enjoyed She-Ra, but with the caveat that it probably felt more engaging to my brain, like as an adult, with it, being media that's for children, because I watched it in Spanish. And I feel like that meant that I had to pay attention in ways that I otherwise would not have. Also, they change it in the 4th season for whatever reason, so don't listen to that version, but the opening theme goes so much harder in Spanish than it does in English.
Hell yeah.
Oh, interesting.
When I first heard it in English, I was like kind of disappointed.
I'm thinking about TTRPG adaptations of media, and I'm kind of like, what is I'm curious about the impulse to play such games beyond like telling a story that is like the one in the podcast, and like I wonder how. I don't know. I'm like, maybe it's just not for me.
I think one challenge that I have always felt, and one reason I haven't gotten into many branded like tabletop role-playing game adaptations, I guess, is the like, in a lot of other media, the existence of the world supports the story that's being told. And so there is a problem. Are either of you familiar with N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that got a role-playing game adaptation, which I have not looked into.
I backed it. It's not out yet, but I backed it. I'm getting it like next month.
Well, maybe you can. So I love those books, but also when I saw I was getting a role-playing game adaptation, I was kind of like, damn, what? Like, yeah. I feel like that world is so geared toward telling the story that she is telling in those books. It's like,
yeah.
What do we do as presumably people who are familiar with the books if you're playing this game? I mean, I can think of stories, but I'm like, I feel like that world is so much about the story that's being told in those books that it feels weird to ignore that to me. I'm curious about the appeal of like narrowness of form or of like world, I guess.
Yeah.
Am I making any sense?
Yes, and a big part of why I backed it was to like see what they do with it.
Yeah.
Because I want to see how they kind of walk that line. Because I think that for things like Magnus Archives and for Old Gods of Appalachia, things that take place in our world but like tilted like 45 degrees, there's room for other stories that aren't about the main thing that makes the world interesting, right?
Yeah.
Or like, sure, there's the Magnus Institute, but are there like other such organizations that are doing similar things in other parts of the world, right?
Yeah.
And I think for like the Broken Earth trilogy, it's like the thing that makes the world cool is addressed so thoroughly by the books.
It is like
what
it is
story
like
is left?
Yeah,
like
that's
the
what I
world
feel
is
like. Yeah.
the world is built in a specific way to help N.K. Jemisin say what she's trying to say.
And then she said it,
And
so
then
we
she
can all
said
go home.
Yeah, that's very much what I feel like. I'm like, what would
Yeah.
I do? What story would I, as a GM, tell in this world that? And again, I'm like, I can come up with them, but they all feel rather insufficient compared to the magnitude of the story that.
Because
Again,
I'm not
if
as smart as N.K. Jemisin, and
Yeah, right.
So I'm excited to see like what they do with it, and if it sticks the landing, I'm very hopeful for it. But it does sound like it's up against like. It sounds like a very difficult endeavor that maybe could have been something less difficult if they had not done it.
Sure.
But also the kind of thing of like, we don't do this because it's easy. We do it because we thought it would be easy, and now we care too much to quit. Like maybe that's that kind of situation, right?
Dom, do you want to plug anything?
Yeah, my novella Redundancies and Potentials came out at the end of February. It is a bite-sized romp about time travel that functions like a fax machine, a private police agency that uses said time travel, and the pitfalls of trying to stop crime before it happens.
Ooh. Incredible.
Check that out. It's Neon Hemlock. Am I right about that? Neon Hemlock
Yes.
books?
Yeah.
Live, laugh,
And you can
love.
find a link to it and also to like all of my short fiction and game design work as well on my website, which is dominiquedickey.com.
And that will be in the show notes. Yay. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for listening to Dungeons and Drama Nerds. We will be back soon with another Dark Time episode, and also stay tuned for the announcement of our next campaign coming at some point soon.
Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Percival, Hornak, and Nicholas Orvis, and this episode was mixed and edited by Percival, Hornak. Our core ensemble are Todd Backus, Jovane Caamaño, Anthony Sertel Dean, Christopher Diercksen, Ben Ferber, Kory Flores, Mieko Gavia, Tess Huth, Romana Isabella, John Johnson, CJ Linton, C. Meaks Meaker, Leo Mock, Dex Phan, and Tristan B. Willis. If you'd like to help us continue exploring the intersections of theater and tabletop role-playing games, consider leaving us a review on your podcast app of choice or supporting us, and getting access to our patron-only bonus content, at patreon.com/dungeonsanddramanerds. You can find our social media and website links, including our cast bios, at the Linktree in our show notes. And be sure to tune in soon for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds.